Keir Starmer is facing the political fight of his life, and this time there's no escape route, no way to spin his way out, and no mechanism to avoid the reckoning that's coming. MPS are about to table a motion that could force local elections across Britain, and if that motion passes, it will be a death sentence for Labour and for Starmer's already crumbling government. Andrew Neil, one of the most respected and feared political commentators in Britain, has just broken down exactly why this motion is so devastating and why Starmer is absolutely terrified of what's about to happen. This isn't just another parliamentary procedure or political manoeuvre that will be forgotten in a week. This is a constitutional mechanism that, if triggered, would put Starmer's government directly before the British people for judgment at a time when his approval ratings are in the basement, when scandal after scandal has destroyed his credibility, and when voters are angrier at their government than they've been in generations. Local elections might sound less dramatic than a general election, but make no mistake, this motion is designed to be fatal to Starmer's political survival. Here's why. Local elections would become a referendum on his leadership and on the corruption, incompetence and constitutional crisis that have defined his time in office. Every council seat that Labour loses would be interpreted as a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister. Every swing to opposition parties would be seen as the public rejecting everything Starmer stands for. And the cumulative effect of losses across hundreds of councils would create irresistible pressure for him to resign, because no Prime Minister can survive when the electorate has delivered such a clear verdict against them. Starmer knows this, his team knows this, and that's why they're doing everything in their power to prevent this motion from even coming to a vote, but the numbers are working against them. MPS from across the political spectrum, including some from Starmer's own party who are desperate to distance themselves from his failures, are backing this motion. They recognise that forcing local elections is the fastest way to end this nightmare and to give voters a voice in what happens next. Andrew Neil's analysis of the situation is characteristically brutal and precise, laying out exactly how the motion would work, what the likely results would be, and why Starmer has every reason to be terrified of facing voters in any election right now. The motion to force local elections is being driven by a coalition of opposition MPS who have recognised that normal mechanisms for holding the government accountable have failed. Starmer has survived vote after vote of no confidence by relying on party loyalty and the narrow parliamentary mathematics that keep his government technically viable. He's ignored calls to resign despite being found by the Supreme Court to have engaged in conduct incompatible with office. He's weathered scandal after scandal by simply refusing to accept that any of them should have consequences for his position. The usual tools of democratic accountability, parliamentary questions, media scrutiny, public pressure have all proven insufficient to force accountability from someone who has decided that no amount of corruption or incompetence should require him to step down. So the opposition has turned to a different mechanism, one that's rarely used, but that exists precisely for situations where government has lost legitimacy but refuses to face voters. The motion would invoke provisions that allow Parliament to call for local elections outside the normal schedule when there are compelling reasons to test public opinion on the current government's performance. The legal and constitutional basis for such a motion is complex, rooted in principles about democratic accountability and the people's right to pass judgment on those who govern them. But the practical effect is simple. If the motion passes, local elections would be scheduled within months, and those elections would become the mechanism through which voters could express their views on Starmer's government. Andrew Neil explained in his analysis that this isn't the same as a general election. Labour wouldn't be removed from national government even if they suffered catastrophic losses in local elections, but the political impact would be nearly identical to a general election defeat because the message would be unmistakable. The public has rejected this government and wants change. Neil pointed out that prime ministers have resigned over far less dramatic electoral setbacks than what Starmer would likely face in forced local elections. Historical examples abound of leaders who lost local or by-elections and concluded that they'd lost public confidence and needed to step aside. Starmer, having already lost public confidence, according to every measure of polling and public sentiment, would face an electoral demolition that would make his position completely untenable. His own MPS would abandon him in droves after such a result, recognising that their own electoral survival depended on separating themselves from a leader who had become toxic to voters. The genius of this motion, as Neil described it, is that it puts the decision directly in the hands of the people, rather than relying on parliamentary processes that can be manipulated through party loyalty and political calculation. Starmer can whip his MPs to support him in confidence votes. He can use party discipline to prevent internal challenges. But he can't control what voters do in the privacy of the voting booth, and he certainly can't spin away a massive electoral rejection across hundreds of councils and thousands of seats. The motion is being led by senior opposition figures who have been coordinating strategy for weeks to maximise its chances of passage. They've been quietly building support among MPS from multiple parties, arguing that this is about democratic accountability rather than partisan advantage. They've reached out to Labour backbenchers who are concerned about their own electoral prospects under Starmer's leadership, making the case that forcing elections now could actually help them by demonstrating that they're willing to let voters have their say rather than protecting a failed leader. Some Labour MPS have indicated privately that they might support the motion or at least abstain rather than voting against it, recognising that being seen to block voters from having a say would be politically suicidal in their constituencies. The parliamentary arithmetic is tight but potentially workable for the motion's supporters. They need a majority of MPS to vote for forcing local elections, which means winning over enough Labour rebels and enough MPS from smaller parties to overcome the government's nominal majority. The whipping operation on both sides has been intense, with the government threatening consequences for any Labour MP who supports or fails to oppose the motion, while the opposition has been offering political cover and support to anyone willing to break ranks. The debate when the motion comes to the floor will be one of the most consequential in recent parliamentary history, with each MP's vote carrying enormous weight for the future of British politics. Andrew Neil's analysis focused particularly on why Starmer is so terrified of this motion and what it reveals about his political vulnerability. Neil pointed out that if Starmer truly believed he still had public support, if he actually thought voters would back him, despite the scandals and the Supreme Court ruling and the manifest failures of governance, he would welcome the opportunity to prove it through elections. The fact that he's fighting desperately to prevent any electoral test tells you everything you need to know about his internal polling and his understanding of how voters view him. Starmer knows he would lose badly, and he knows that loss would end his political career immediately. So he's in the impossible position of trying to prevent democratic accountability while claiming to respect democratic principles, of arguing that voters shouldn't get to pass judgment on him while insisting that he represents their interests. The hypocrisy is obvious and damaging, reinforcing perceptions that he cares more about clinging to power than about respecting the democratic process or accepting the will of the people. Neil also noted the historical precedent this motion represents, pointing out that while forced local elections are rare, the principle behind them is fundamental to British democracy. Governments derive their legitimacy from public consent, and when that consent is clearly withdrawn, mechanisms must exist to test whether the government still represents the people's will. The scandals and crises that have engulfed Starmer's government have created exactly the kind of situation where such a test is not just appropriate but necessary to preserve democratic legitimacy. The strategic thinking behind the motion to force local elections goes deeper than just creating political embarrassment for Starmer. The opposition has calculated that even if the motion itself fails to pass, the debate and the vote will inflict serious damage on the government. Every Labour MP who votes against allowing voters to have their say will be on record as prioritising party loyalty over democratic accountability. Every argument the government makes against holding elections will sound like an admission that they know they've lost public support and are afraid to face as voters. And every indication that the vote will be closed, that significant numbers of MPS support forcing elections, will reinforce the narrative that Starmer's government has lost legitimacy legitimacy, even among its own supporters. The opposition is prepared for multiple scenarios if the motion passes. They get the electoral contest they want, one where voters can deliver a verdict on Starmer's corruption and incompetence. If the motion fails, but only barely, they can claim moral victory and use the close vote as evidence that even Parliament recognises the government has lost public confidence. If the motion fails decisively, they can still use the debate to highlight the government's fear of voters and to put on record all the reasons why elections are necessary. There's no scenario where this motion helps Starmer, which is exactly why his team is so desperate to prevent it from even being voted on. They've explored every procedural mechanism to block or delay the vote, but the parliamentary rules are clear, and the Speaker has indicated that the motion is in order and will be debated and voted on. Andrew Neil walked through the likely scenarios if local elections are actually forced to happen. The polling data suggests Labour would suffer catastrophic losses, potentially losing control of dozens of councils and losing hundreds or even thousands of council seats. These wouldn't be losses in traditionally conservative areas where Labour never expected to win anyway. These would be losses in Labour heartlands, in councils they've controlled for generations, in areas where voters had supported them consistently but are now so disgusted with Starmer's leadership that they're willing to vote for anyone else. Neil highlighted specific councils and regions where the collapse in Labour support has been most dramatic, places where Starmer's scandals and failures have resonated particularly strongly. He noted that the loss of these traditional strongholds would be psychologically devastating for the party, forcing them to confront that they've lost not just swing voters, but their core base. The analysis included comparisons to historical electoral disasters that had led to leadership changes. And in every case, the losses that Starmer would likely face would be worse than the losses that had forced previous leaders to resign. Neil suggested that Starmer might not even wait for the final results. If early returns showed the predicted demolition, that he might resign on election night itself rather than face the humiliation of the complete results. The campaign that would unfold if local elections are forced would be unlike any Britain has seen in modern times. It wouldn't be about traditional local issues like bin collections and planning decisions. It would be a national campaign focused entirely on Starmer's fitness for office and on whether voters still had confidence in his government. Every opposition party would run on the same basic message. This is your chance to tell Starmer what you think of his corruption, his incompetence, his defiance of the Supreme Court, his lies and his failures. Local candidates would almost be irrelevant. The contest would be entirely about the Prime Minister and his record. Labour would struggle to find any positive message to run on. They couldn't campaign on their achievements because there aren't any. They couldn't defend Starmer's character because the scandals are indefensible, and they couldn't promise things would get better under his continued leadership because voters have stopped believing anything he says. The best they could hope for would be to minimise losses by running local candidates who distance themselves from national leadership. But even that strategy has limited effectiveness when voters are determined to send a message to the Prime Minister. Andrew Neil predicted that voter turnout would be unusually high for local elections, driven by people who wanted to use the opportunity to register their disgust with the government. This high turnout would make the results even more devastating for Labour, as motivated voters turned out specifically to vote against them. The international implications of forced local elections producing the expected Labour collapse would also be significant. Other world leaders have been watching Britain's political crisis with concern, wondering whether the government has any stability or legitimacy. A massive electoral rejection of Starmer would answer that question definitively and would raise serious questions about whether foreign governments could or should continue dealing with him as a legitimate leader. Trade negotiations would become more difficult as other countries would be reluctant to finalise agreements with someone who might not be in office much longer. Security cooperation would be complicated by questions about whether Starmer had the authority and backing to make commitments on Britain's behalf. The economic impact would be felt as markets reacted to political instability and as investors became more cautious about British assets. None of this would be catastrophic in itself. Britain wouldn't collapse because its Prime Minister lost local elections, but it would represent another significant degradation in the country's standing and stability. Andrew Neil pointed out that Britain couldn't afford much more of this self-inflicted damage, that the accumulation of scandals and crises was taking a real toll on the country's prosperity and influence, and that the only way to start rebuilding was to resolve the leadership question definitively. Forced local elections would provide that resolution one way or another. The debate in Parliament when the motion comes to a vote will be intense and consequential. Opposition leaders will argue passionately for democratic accountability and for giving voters a voice. They'll catalogue Starmer's failures and scandals, making the case that a government this corrupt and this incompetent must face electoral judgment. They'll argue that preventing voters from having their say is itself undemocratic and shows that the government knows it has lost public confidence. Government ministers will have the nearly impossible task of arguing against holding elections. Without admitting that they're afraid of the results, they'll likely try to claim that local elections would be disruptive or expensive, or that they're not the appropriate mechanism for testing confidence in national government. But these arguments will sound hollow and self-serving, and they'll be easily countered by pointing out that the only reason to oppose elections is fear of losing them. The speeches from Labour backbenchers will be particularly important to watch. MPs who represent marginal seats or who are concerned about their own electoral prospects will face enormous pressure both to support party leadership and to show their constituents that they're willing to let voters decide. Some will undoubtedly give speeches that try to have it both ways, expressing support for democratic principles while ultimately voting against the motion. But the awkwardness and insincerity of such positions will be obvious. Any Labour MPs who actually vote for the motion or who abstain will become instant news stories, their defection seen as evidence of how weak Starmer's position has become, even within his own party. Andrew Neil's analysis included a particularly devastating segment on what the motion reveals about the state of British democracy and accountability. He pointed out that in a healthy democratic system, a leader who had been found by the Supreme Court to have engaged in conduct incompatible with office, who had been exposed in multiple corruption scandals, who had defied constitutional principles, and who had lost public confidence so completely would have already resigned. The fact that Starmer hasn't resigned and that his party continues to protect him, despite overwhelming evidence of unfitness, represents a failure of the political accountability mechanisms that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. The motion to force local elections is an attempt to bypass those failed mechanisms and to restore democratic accountability through direct voter input. Neil argued that if this motion fails, if Parliament refuses to allow voters to pass judgment on a government that has so clearly lost legitimacy, then Britain's democratic system has a serious problem that needs to be addressed through constitutional reform. The principle that governments must maintain public confidence and must face voters when that confidence is lost is fundamental to democracy, and if it can be circumvented by party loyalty and political calculation, then the system isn't working as it should. Neil suggested that regardless of partisan affiliation, anyone who cares about democratic accountability should support mechanisms that allow voters to have their say when government has clearly failed, because the alternative is a system where leaders can engage in corruption and incompetence without consequence, as long as they maintain parliamentary majority through party discipline.